Committee will come to order. I want to welcome everybody today to our subcommittee hearing for the Work and Welfare Subcommittee. The title of our hearing today is Where is All the Welfare Money Going? Reclaiming TANF Non-Assistance Dollars to Lift Americans Out of Poverty. My name is Darren LaHood, and I represent Illinois' 16th District of Illinois, covering much of central and northwest parts of the state. Recently, Republicans were able to secure a major victory with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which strengthened work requirements in the direct cash assistance portion of the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. Those changes followed our hearing in March in this room, highlighting loopholes in the current law that allowed states to game the work participation rate. This hearing will take the next step by focusing on the other side of TANF, which is non-assistance spending. Non-assistance funding constitutes the majority of the TANF block grant, nearly 78% of combined federal and state spending. This is spending that is not for basic assistance or direct checks to welfare recipients. Concerns have emerged that the non-assistance part of TANF lacks guardrails and is not focused on helping people move from welfare to work. National headlines fueled by a massive embezzlement scandal in Mississippi have drawn increased scrutiny about TANF, leaving people to ask, where is all the welfare money going? In June, Republican members of the Ways and Means Committee sent a letter to HHS asking the agency about their response to Mississippi and their efforts to safeguard federal funds in other states. In response, HHS outlined a number of statutory limitations that constrain their ability to conduct oversight and indicated a willingness to work with the committee to improve the TANF program. I've heard from my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who have expressed frustration on this point. In fact, during our last hearing, my friend from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, shared her concern about how states are using TANF money and commented about questionable use of funds in Wisconsin for luxury apartments. I agree with Ms. Moore and many others. Current TANF law lacks basic financial safeguards included in most other federal programs, making it easy for states to divert funds and increasing the risk of fraud and abuse. Here are some of the examples. First, current law permits states to use federal grants in, quote, any manner that is reasonably calculated, unquote, to achieve one of TANF's 4 purposes, which is to provide assistance to needy families, end dependence of needy parents on government benefits, reduce out-of-wedlock pregnancies, and fourth, promote the formation of 2-parent families. These are worthy goals, but it's rare for allowable spending in a federal program to be solely defined by vaguely written purposes. Second, unlike most federal programs, the TANF statute does not put limits on administrative costs or obligation deadlines for spending funds. As a result, program management is one of the 4 largest expenditure categories. Further, with no deadline to spend TANF dollars, many states have built up large reserves instead of spending them on families who need them. Third, TANF is not subject to the Payment Integrity and Information Act, even though the Office of Management and Budget identified TANF as a susceptible program. HHS has never reported an improper payment rate estimate. Finally, TANF law allows states to spend funds on a wide variety of social services, like social welfare and child care, but with none of the federal rules that normally apply. This has resulted in TANF being spent on programs that are not tracked for outcomes or the quality of services being paid for with federal tax dollars. All of this adds up to a vulnerable program that makes it possible for fraud and abuse to occur like what happened in the state of Mississippi. One of our witnesses today, Mr. Shad White, has firsthand knowledge of the Mississippi case and is here to provide recommendations on how this can be avoided in other states in the future. Today, we will also hear from witnesses examples of how states have been able to use TANF non-assistant funds to strategically support initiatives that do effectively move individuals from welfare to work. Some states have also built their strong financial controls and audit practices, which can be used in other states. I think all of these things should be bipartisan issues. We should be able to work together to improve accountability in this vital program. It's time to reclaim TANF funds to ensure dollars are intentionally focused on removing barriers to work, reducing dependency, and growing the capacity of individuals to realize their full potential. I'm honored to have our guests here today and look forward to your testimony. With that, I'm pleased to recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Illinois, ranking member Danny Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me welcome all who have come and express thanks and appreciation to all of our witnesses, and thank you. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program fails to help the vast majority of families in need. It is shameful, but it is the result of policies my colleagues demanded. Republicans insisted on making it so hard for states to help poor families who need cash assistance, education, training, and child care to escape poverty that states started diverting funds to other uses called non-assistance spending. In 2020, states spent only about 20% of their federal and state TANF funds on cash assistance and only about 10% on work, education, and training. Some states, like Mississippi and Tennessee, chose to stash tens of millions of dollars in a bank account rather than help poor families. Republicans insisted on imposing crushing administrative burdens designed to kick families off direct cash assistance under the guise of accountability. Even though Republican witnesses recommended lessening work requirements and restrictions on education and training, the GOP debt limit provisions doubled down on harsh work requirements. These Republican-driven policies trap families in poverty by rejecting them altogether, pushing families into meager child-only TANF, or forcing them into poverty-level jobs rather than building economic security. Republicans insisted on TANF being a block grant that gave states wide latitude to fund activities that do not help poor parents. Incredibly, unlike any other law, Republicans insisted on a statutory prohibition on federal oversight that limits transparency, fraud detection, and enforcement. When Mississippi advocates asked this subcommittee for help years ago to get the Trump administration to examine how the state was using TANF, we had to direct them to state officials to investigate this issue due to this prohibition on enforcement. Unfortunately, even after the fraud revelation, advocates still cannot get answers about how TANF is used locally. I hope that our witness, State Auditor White, will help remedy that lack of transparency. It is also deeply troubling that less than 24 hours after the TANF fraud was announced, Mississippi lawmakers, at the urging of State Auditor White, advanced a bill to allow him to review the tax returns of TANF cash recipients, a requirement that was not imposed, to my knowledge, on the many TANF subcontractors and businesses. So let us be clear. TANF is working exactly as the Republican TANF system was designed. Democrats absolutely think TANF needs a fundamental overhaul, but any reform should start with improving family stability by reducing burdensome requirements and providing sufficient access to financial support, child care, education, and career pathways to help families thrive. Families need stability before parents can be reliable workers, and reliable workers need quality jobs to escape poverty. Predictable financial assistance is central to stability for parents to hold self-sustaining jobs. We saw during the pandemic that reliable financial assistance via the child tax credit helped cut child poverty by 40%. Further, a recent report by Chapin Hall details how state policies that increase access to TANF and cash assistance are associated with decreased child maltreatment. For example, a $100 increase in TANF cash benefits is associated with reduction in maternal self-reported physical child maltreatment. In contrast, for families receiving TANF who experience maternal hardship, such as difficulty meeting basic needs, they are 3 times more likely to experience a neglect investigation and 4 times more likely to experience a physical abuse investigation. TANF benefits in most states remain at their lowest value since the program started in 1996. Yet research shows that for families with children under the age of 5, receiving an extra $3,000 per year boosts children's adult earnings by 17%. So investing in cash assistance now would help lift children out of poverty both now and in the future. The failure of TANF falls disproportionately on children of color whose families experience greater barriers to economic stability. Black, American Indian, and Alaska Native, Asian, and Latino children experience higher poverty rates than white children. Yet 48% of Black children live in states with benefits amounts below 20% of the federal poverty level, compared to only 35% of white children. I served on this committee back when there was a good faith bipartisan effort to reform TANF. Now those efforts have been repeatedly torpedoed by extremists demanding harsh work requirements. Limiting states from using non-assistance dollars will do nothing to lift Americans out of poverty. If we do nothing to help states serve low-income families by providing cash assistance and work supports while also removing the ineffective work requirements. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. It's my pleasure now to yield to the full chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Jason Smith.
Thank you, Chairman LaHood and Ranking Member Davis, for holding this hearing about how Congress can strengthen the non-direct assistance side of the temporary assistance for needy families, or TANF, to lift more Americans out of poverty and protect the taxpayers who fund the program. I'd also like to give a special welcome to one of our witnesses today, Mr. Robert Nodell, the Director of the Department of Social Services in my home state. He's a native of God's country, the best congressional district in the entire nation, Missouri's 8th, which happens to be my district. And also a graduate of Southeast Missouri State. He's a Fighting Red Hawk. We're glad you're here, Robert. Robert combines his love of Missouri with a career that's dedicated to service, focusing on improving education and social services. Robert, thank you so much again for being here. It's an honor to have you. In hearings all around the country, we have heard how small businesses are being impacted by the labor shortage. The Fiscal Responsibility Act, it delivered a major win for families and small businesses by strengthening work requirements in the TANF program. It also put an end to attempts by states to exploit loopholes around the work participation rate and force them to measure outcomes that matter, like how many recipients get a job. This was a major step toward restoring the program to its core mission, acting as a bridge out of poverty. We have more work to do, though. Almost 8 in every $10 in this program are spent on something other than direct checks to families. TANF was meant to help people get a job, but we need basic financial guardrails to guarantee taxpayer money is not wasted. That lack of accountability has opened the door for states to treat TANF non-assistance funds like a slush fund. In some cases, states use the funds to fill budget gaps for unrelated purposes. In others, these funds pay for social programs that the federal government already pays for, but avoids federal rules on how states can use that money, creating even more duplication and overlap. In the worst cases, the lack of controls and accountability has led to outright fraud and abuse. For example, in Mississippi, $77 million in non-assistance TANF dollars was misspent through waste, fraud, and abuse. To put this in perspective, Mississippi receives $86 million in TANF annually and has the highest rate of child poverty in the entire country. Money that should have gone towards the vulnerable went instead toward building volleyball courts. Every Ways and Means Republican has asked Secretary Becerra if HHS has taken any action to correct this situation. On its current path, TANF non-assistance is failing beneficiaries who need economic security. And it's also failing taxpayers whose money should be spent intentionally and strategically to support work. The basic problem at hand is the lack of accountability. More money tomorrow does not solve the problem of misspending money today. Thank you to each of our witnesses for testifying today about how to ensure TANF fulfills its mission of lifting people out of poverty through work. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. We're pleased to have our witnesses here today, and we have a tremendous amount of experience here today with all of you, and so we want to thank you for being here today. I will now introduce them. Mr. Clarence Carter, I'll start from my left to right, is the Commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Human Services. Mr. Shad White is the State Auditor for the state of Mississippi. Mr. Robert Nodell is the Director of the Missouri Department of Social Services. Ms. Christy Putman is the Secretary of the Arkansas Department of Human Services. And Dr. Aisha Endora is the CEO of Springboard to Opportunities in Jackson, Mississippi. Welcome to you all. Mr. Carter, I'll now recognize you for 5 minutes to deliver your opening statement.
Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on potential reforms to the TANF program specifically and on the broader safety net in general. My name is Clarence H. Carter, and I currently serve as Commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Human Services in the administration of Governor Bill Lee. Tennessee is my last stop in a 32-year career in the administration of public safety net programs and agencies at the federal, state, and local levels of government. During that career, I've had the blessing and good fortune of serving 2 presidents, 4 governors, and a mayor in this, my life's purpose and passion. My career predates the welfare reform of 1996. I hearken back to the excitement and anticipation of that era. At that time, I was serving as Virginia's Commissioner of the Department of Social Services. I recall a conversation I had with one of our consumers regarding her experience with the new program. She said to me, when they told me I would have to work, I was scared. She had not been employed since the birth of her first child 15 years prior, and as such, had serious concerns about her ability to successfully rejoin the workforce. She recounted how her case manager believed in her and assisted her in finding a job. She went on to say, "Do you know what I did with my first paycheck? I took my kids out for pizza." With tears streaming down her face, finally she said with pride, "Mr. Carter, at the beginning I was afraid, but now I know I will never be on welfare again because I know I can do this." I share this reflection because it is that very inspiration, hope, and vision that drives me every day in this work. Mere subsistence is not enough. Individuals need hope and the ability to determine their own destiny. Our system of public support should be about freeing people to act in their own best interest, not making them wards of an ever-expanding and complex public assistance system. The TANF program was built on two fundamental principles: work for receipt of benefits and time limits. While those twin pillars are as important today as they were 27 years ago, we have fallen far short of the lofty goals envisioned at the signing of the legislation. In the previous administration, I served as director of the Office of Family Assistance, the program office within HHS tasked with administering the TANF program. Upon arrival in 2017, we saw that there was in excess of $5 billion in unexpended TANF funds nationwide. We sent a letter encouraging states to use their unexpended balances to demonstrate innovations in the program. Unfortunately, our encouragement fell flat. States needed more than encouragement from the federal government. They needed a mechanism and additional funding to do so. It was with that understanding that guided us in crafting the opportunity and economic mobility demonstrations, which were included as part of the President's budget in fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 21. I've included those budget proposals with my written testimony. Little did I know that the next stop in my professional journey would afford me the opportunity to put into practice what I had encouraged at the federal level. Of the unexpended TANF monies nationwide, Tennessee had the largest amount, in excess of $700 million. This brings us to what we are doing with TANF and Governor Lee's administration. In conjunction with our Department of Human Services, the state legislature and governor crafted the TANF Opportunity Act. This legislation was designed to serve families in need and mandated a forced spending mechanism. Perhaps most impactful for this committee, this legislation also authorized 7 large-scale demonstrations aimed at helping families overcome the challenges they face. The objective of these 3-year demonstrations is to test unique, community-designed, collaborative models for building the economic, social, and developmental capacity of TANF recipients. Their results will provide valuable insights into how best to refine our overall TANF model. Another important component of this legislation is its emphasis on evaluation and finding out what works. To accomplish this, we engaged an evaluation firm to design random controlled trials for each of the 7 demonstrations, the gold standard in scientific evaluation. In closing, we find ourselves in an important crossroads in the history of our nation's safety net. The work of this subcommittee can positively impact the lives of millions of Americans. I believe that the interventions we have undertaken in Tennessee offer a framework that can launch the next generation of safety net reform. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to share this testimony, and I applaud your courage to embark upon this necessary journey. I can state unequivocally that under the leadership of Governor Bill Lee, Tennessee is dedicated to partnering with you in this effort.
Thank you, Commissioner Carter. Now turn to Auditor White. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Davis. It's an honor to be here with you. My name is State Auditor Shad White. I'm the 42nd State Auditor of Mississippi. I run a team of about 140 CPAs, career investigators, attorneys, and support staff. And 3 years ago, we uncovered what is now the largest public fraud scheme in the history of the state of Mississippi, and it was fueled almost entirely by TANF dollars. What I thought I would do is tell you a little bit about how that case came about, and then I have some thoughts and recommendations on policies that might be implemented to prevent what we saw in Mississippi from happening in other places that I'd be happy to get into. In the summer of 2019, this case started when we received a whistleblower tip that suggested that there may be a kickback between the head of the Department of Human Services in Mississippi, so that's the agency that handles TANF, and a vendor to DHS, our Department of Human Services. I then ordered an investigation by our career investigators and simultaneously told our auditors, who were doing our single audit at the time, that's the audit that we do for you, the federal government, to describe how federal funds are spent, to look at what was going on with TANF dollars in the state of Mississippi. We audited and investigated for about 6-7 months, and at the end of that time, we determined that north of $90 million of both TANF funds and other welfare funds had been misspent in the state. And we also determined that there were likely multiple fraud schemes that had gone on. So at that point, we knew that some of the organizations, one nonprofit in particular that was receiving funds and misspending them, was likely to also get an additional grant, so we had to act quickly in the auditor's office. I took what we had found to a local prosecutor in Hinds County. He acted quickly and indicted 6 individuals, successfully cutting off the flow of funds and stopping the misspending. That was in February of 2020. We also concluded our single audit a few months later, and in that single audit, what we found was multiple instances of misspent TANF funds outside of the fraud cases. So I'll catch you up a bit to where we are today. 6 individuals have now pleaded guilty to either state or federal charges. Those charges range from money laundering, fraud, RICO charges. And that case, that criminal case, is still ongoing, so I'll be limited in what I can say about the criminal case right now. My office has turned over everything that we have to the FBI, and the FBI and federal prosecutors at the Department of Justice have asked to take the leading role in indicting and investigating anyone who is new beyond the original 6 people that we investigated. We agreed to that arrangement, and we have been assisting them since then. That was about 3 years ago. As far as the other misspent money goes, the state is now suing multiple individuals to get some of that money back. And I won't tell you every example of misspent funds in Mississippi, but I'll give you a bit of the flavor of what we found in our single audit. We found that TANF dollars had gone to pay for advertisements at out-of-state college bowl games. We found that TANF money had gone to pay for advertisement at NCAA bracket games outside of Mississippi. We found that TANF dollars had gone to pay celebrities and athletes in Mississippi with little or no work product required. We found that one nonprofit in particular, a nonprofit run by Nancy and Zach New, that's a mother and son duo, had received tens of millions of dollars of TANF money, and they had misspent much of that money, some of it to their personal benefit. So Mr. New repaid a loan from his 401k program with TANF dollars. They paid for a house for Miss New using government money. They paid for cars for themselves. They paid for technology like iPads. This list goes on and on and on. If you would like to see the full list of what we uncovered, I would suggest that you read our single audit from 2020 or the 2 years after that, and that details some of those findings. What I would like to say mainly is thank you to all of you for inviting all of us here and for looking into this, because my hope is that the country can learn from Mississippi's experience so that what we saw, the fraud that we saw in Mississippi, doesn't happen in other states. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Auditor. We'll next turn to Director Nodell from the state of Missouri. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Rob Nodell, Director, Missouri Department of Social Services, and thanks to Chairman Smith, and thank you, Chairman LaHood, and Ranking Member Davis, members of the committee. I'm honored to serve in the gubernatorial appointed position as Director of our Missouri Department of Social Services and on behalf of our 5,700 hardworking team members and the over 2 million Missourians that our department serves every day. We appreciate the opportunity. Missouri is fortunate to currently have an unemployment rate of 2.5%, among the lowest of any state. However, we have experienced a steady decline in our labor force participation rate since the 1990s. And while we rank above the national average, our current rate as of May of this year is 63.4%, which is the lowest during any non-COVID pandemic month since 1985. Like most states, Missouri's population is aging, with more and more citizens approaching retirement, and especially in rural communities and inner cities, our population is not growing. This creates labor force challenges in communities looking to staff healthcare, nursing facilities, provide school bus drivers, hire child care workers, and fill other critical jobs that make cities and towns great places to call home. TANF in Missouri, if it achieves its full potential, dovetails very well with Governor Mike Parson's paramount priority of workforce development, lifting citizens out of poverty by equipping them with the skills, education, and attainable expectations to become self-sufficient and family supporting does wonders to strengthen families, improve communities, and save and indeed grow tax dollars, making the American dream more attainable. And that's what we're doing in Missouri with our TANF block grant. More than ever, we're looking for ways to meaningfully assist our able-bodied neighbors who encounter barriers to self-sufficiency and do face that unfortunate lifetime of dependency on public assistance to survive otherwise. These citizens need the American dream, and the American dream needs them. Our communities are counting on us, both through this committee and throughout our states, to lift up families to be full participants as creators and consumers, so that we can function and thrive in a way that fulfills our social contract. Our TANF block grants, if funded and administered with the necessary balance of flexibility and strict accountability, can deliver on that promise. Missouri serves hundreds of thousands of citizens through our block grant programs, providing the necessary skills, training, mentoring, nutrition, and removal of barriers to ensure a successful path to employment. We all know the difference between somebody who starts a job that they aren't prepared for as opposed to starting a job that they are well equipped and trained to succeed in. The former often returns to public assistance programs in short order, and the latter does not. Missouri invests TANF dollars into the Jobs for American Graduates, or JAG program, boasting a 98% graduation rate, with 86% of graduates transitioning to either college, a job, or military service. We operate 4 Excel centers, which are adult high schools, with 4 satellite facilities offering free high school education with flexible schedules and life coaching within our state. 83% of graduates end up employed, and another 10% enroll in college or in advanced skills training. One shining example of what our TANF dollars are doing when properly expended is Denise Hayes. With the onset of the COVID pandemic, she was at a crossroads. After 8 years of working at a local nursing center, she was laid off, and when public schools transitioned to remote education, she had a child care barrier to consider. While staying home with her children, she attempted to find part-time employment, but opportunities were scarce due to her remote and rural location. After 18 months of unemployment and once her children returned to in-person schooling, Denise applied and was approved for temporary assistance benefits. As a participant, she qualified for the Missouri Work Assistance, or MWA, program. Having previously worked in a nursing facility, she had some knowledge of the medical field and was interested in a phlebotomy program at a local community college. MWA not only helped pay for her training program, but they were also able to help with the gas expense as she faced a 120-mile round trip in order to attend those classes. When Denise got to the point in her program that she needed scrubs to wear, MWA was able to help cover this expense. Denise recently began work at the River Oaks Nursing Home in Pemiscot County in the Missouri Boot Heel and is preparing to take her state test for certification, after which she has plans to apply for those better jobs. As a CPT, she will have more stable and higher-paying job opportunities. Denise is grateful for the financial assistance that MWA provided during her journey. I will caution this committee that as pandemic relief dollars go away, and if and when state tax revenues tighten or decline, state agencies will be under increasing pressure to color outside the lines and push boundaries when it comes to TANF spending. Program integrity measures from both state and federal levels will be more important than ever, and we urge you to consider strategically enhancing and leveraging TANF dollars within the 4 corners of the program to provide benefits, and we encourage you to consider enhanced program integrity measures to make clear not only to states, but our partner agencies of what appropriate and inappropriate uses of TANF dollars are. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Director Nodell. We'll next turn to Secretary Christy Putman of Arkansas. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chairman Smith, Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to speak to this committee. I'm Christy Putnam. I'm the Secretary of Arkansas Department of Human Services. My whole life's work has provided me perspective as a state and federal grant manager, a state and federal grant recipient, an employer seeking to participate in TANF and other workforce programs as a partner, and a potential benefits seeker. I could have been a TANF recipient at several points in my life when I was a single mother. I now have experience in several states working with the very program I believe can be leveraged to promote thriving families and communities. Thanks to Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders' trust in me and our amazing team at the Department of Human Services, we now have an opportunity to completely revisit how TANF is being used in Arkansas to support and strengthen families and communities. We are taking a holistic approach to our TANF work by focusing on family-centric practices, community empowerment, and what we call the ABC workforce development concept. We want people to have a job, then a better job, and then a career. Specifically, steps we have already taken include integrating our TANF case management workforce with our human services eligibility specialists so families in need of support can access TANF workforce supports, food assistance, childcare, and healthcare in one location. This is family-centric. mobilizing these same services to serve communities and families for whom transportation is an issue. This is also family-centric. Meeting with employers, community organizations, philanthropic entities, and human services staff to determine family needs, employment opportunities, gaps in services, and how best to address. This is community empowering and is results-driven. Further, on February 9th of this year, Governor Sanders established the Arkansas Workforce Cabinet and Chief Workforce Officer in Executive Order 23-16. The Arkansas Workforce Cabinet is comprised of all 6 state agencies that provide or coordinate career and technical education and workforce development. Led by the Chief Workforce Officer, we, the secretaries of these 6 cabinets, meet monthly along with the Secretary of Transformation and Shared Services to prepare and recommend a data-driven strategic plan that will ensure a talent and outcome-driven education and workforce system. These will fit into Governor Sanders' 3 priorities of education, public safety, and economic development and tax cuts. We will do this through strategic cross-cabinet collaboration, working to align resources that help people first find a job, then a better job, and finally a career. A job, entry level, is a start, but not a way to sustain a household. A better job is next level that provides better income and experience, and a career in which people contribute and feel fulfilled in giving back is the goal. Meaningful work encourages individuals and families to overcome hardships, increases intergenerational economic mobility, and supports better physical and mental health. TANF will be an important tool for the Workforce Cabinet in our efforts to increase Arkansas's workforce participation rate and family economic success and decrease dependency on public assistance. The Arkansas legislature was also instrumental in changing how we use our TANF dollars by passing legislation during the 2023 session to transfer the program from the Division of Workforce Services to the Department of Human Services. Legislative leadership recognized that in order to promote family economic stability and maximize the effectiveness of workforce development funding and initiatives, DHS could offer coordinated services, including prevention and family preservation services that holistically meet the 4 purposes of TANF and provide assistance in removing barriers to work. With its transfer to DHS, we plan to integrate TANF internal controls for reconciliation of cash draws to expenditures and grant reporting processes with our existing finance and accounting unit that oversees draws for all other federally funded assistance programs. Arkansas is looking to be transformative while improving accountability for TANF expenditures and outcomes, particularly around non-cash assistance initiatives. To this end, I have 3 recommendations for this committee around TANF policy. First, continue to support states' abilities to contract with private, faith-based, and community organizations if appropriate oversight is demonstrated. Second, consider allowing states to reinstate high-performance bonuses with payments not to the state for high performance, but to employers and families that successfully move their employees and themselves off of welfare. Third, review definitions and requirements for TANF that conflict with or are duplicative of other benefits programs, and seek to consolidate such policy to be consistent across all programs. Our children and families do not come to us in pieces. We need to stop planning and budgeting for them as if they do. In closing, I would like to express my sincere appreciation again to Ways and Means Chairman Smith, Work and Welfare Subcommittee Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, and all of the members of the committee. I look forward to your leadership on TANF policies that allow us in the states to be transformative, and Arkansas stands ready to work in partnership with the families and communities we serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Putnam. We'll now recognize Dr. Ian Dora, who's the CEO of Springboard to Opportunities from Jackson, Mississippi. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to present testimony today on the urgent matter of effective solutions to lift families out of poverty. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge that all of us sitting here share one common goal: to ensure that federal funding has the strongest possible impact on ending the devastation of poverty in America. To date, many arguments on this issue have focused on imposing more restrictions on recipients to achieve this, which is proven to only intensify the inefficiencies present in the current policy. In effect, we are blaming the families for their poverty, rather than interrogating the policies that allow these inadequacies to occur. I lead Springboard to Opportunities, which works with families living in federally subsidized affordable housing in Jackson, Mississippi. Families who are meant to be served by temporary assistance for needy families. Most are Black women, mothers working full-time, many overtime, but still living on the fringes of poverty. On average, the families we work with make less than $13,000 annually. The population I work with is the very population in which TANF was designed to support. However, I know of only one person out of the thousands that I work with that is currently receiving TANF. Brandy, who has consistently worked while also raising her children. Like many low-wage workers, she has experienced brief breaks of unemployment while going between jobs. When she applied for TANF and didn't meet the state requirement of getting a job within a week, she was forced to be a volunteer at the Mississippi Department of Human Services office, filing paperwork for less than minimum wage until she found what her caseworker deemed adequate employment. But Brandy's story is not unique. 90% of Mississippians who apply for TANF do not receive it. Families I work with cite the barriers to entry, including burdensome paperwork, a lack of supportive services, fear of sanctions, and inefficient financial support. Ashayla is a perfect example of this reality. She was working in the food service industry and as a full-time caregiver for her grandparents. The only way she could maintain both responsibilities was to pay for childcare for her daughter, totaling over $360 a month. The $170 per month she would have received from the state program would not have even covered the cost of her childcare. Officials will claim that restrictions are intended to prevent abuse and fraud, but they continue to trap families in a cycle of generational poverty, while the actual perpetuators of fraud have been the people in power overseeing the program. If anything can be learned from the TANF scandal in Mississippi, in which non-assistance funds went to paying for horse stables rather than keeping funds in the basic assistance category to help families pay for the necessities like diapers for babies or food for families living in poverty, is that we are focused on the wrong problem. Additional restrictions on the recipients are not the answer. Instead of increasing burdens that reduce the efficiency of the program and further push parents and children into poverty, we should cut out the bureaucratic red tape. That is exactly what we've been doing for the last 5 years with the Magnolia Mothers Trust, a program that Springboard started because so many government programs, including TANF, do not work. Instead of endless applications and heavy restrictions, the Magnolia Mothers Trust offers $1,000 a month and cash assistance to moms in poverty for 1 year without restrictions. In addition to cash support, our moms receive one-on-one support from trained staff to help them identify their goals and support them along the way. And what we've learned is that this money allows families to thrive. Yes, they spend it on basic needs such as childcare, groceries, and utility bills, but it also allows them to plan for the future. Like Ebony, who started her own business as a salon owner. She's not only an entrepreneur, but she's also employing others. Or Anquinette, who just graduated with a degree in early childhood education and is on her way to a higher paying job. Additionally, recipients are able to better provide for their children, who in turn perform better in school. These results are lasting, with our longitudinal research showing that families continue to reap the benefits of our one-year program years after it ends. In the 5 years in which we have been running this program, we have learned that the dignity and agency that Cash Without Restrictions provides allows a family to dream about the future and reach toward it. Let's reimagine what's possible with TANF, as we've done with the Magnolia Mothers Trust that provides cash assistance without work requirements, because then we can truly enable families to break free from the cycle of poverty and achieve economic security. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And I want to thank all of you for your valuable testimony today and the contributions you make to your states and different agencies. We will now proceed to the question and answer session of today's hearing, and I'll begin by recognizing myself. I'll start with you, Auditor White. Could you go into some more detail on recommendations you have for us as federal lawmakers as we hear about the scandal in Mississippi and trying to make sure that that doesn't happen again? And specifically, in your testimony, you talked about policies related to making sure no one over 200% of poverty receives non-assistance funds and limiting the number of exceptions for dollars flowing to non-employment related activities.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a few recommendations that we've discussed in my office. One has to do with the lack of monitoring. So what we saw at DHS in Mississippi was that large grants were being handed out to nonprofits, and then the agency itself was not showing proof that they went out and monitored those nonprofits to ensure that the dollars were actually going to benefit the people who are eligible. So the Office of the State Auditor in Mississippi, and this predates me actually, it goes back to my predecessor back in 2013, found this happening at our Department of Human Services and wrote this in our single audit over and over, year after year. our Department of Human Services is not monitoring its subgrantees, its nonprofits, to ensure that the dollars are reaching needy folks. And so what we ultimately found was that there was a reason these nonprofits weren't being monitored. The head of the agency did not want them monitored because he was handing large amounts of funds to the nonprofits, and then he and the nonprofit executives were discussing ways to spend those dollars in violation of the law and in violation of TANF regs. So one easy recommendation that I would make is anytime HHS sees in a single audit that an agency is not monitoring their subgrantees, their nonprofits, something needs to be done about it. An OIG agent needs to be sent in. The HHS needs to look closely at that nonprofit, level penalties against that agency. Monitoring needs to be taken seriously, and it was not in the state of Mississippi. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the 200% comment that I made. One thing that we noticed in Mississippi was that dollars were going to entities and causes where there was no real proof that anyone participating in an event was needy. So, for example, we would see dollars going to rent a private softball field, and then a softball team, a private softball team, travel softball team called the Mississippi Bombers would play on that softball field. And when we asked, is anybody on that softball team needy? The answer was, well, no, but TANF dollars can go to folks who are not needy, so maybe it's okay that this happened. And also, the softball field is in Jackson, and Jackson metro area is home to tons of needy folks, so that was the justification from DHS. In our opinion, in the auditor's office, that did not comply with the four principles of TANF, and it did not comply with the intention of TANF in the first place because there was no proof that this was doing anything to advance any of the four principles. So my point in making that comment about limiting the access of TANF funds to folks under 200% of the poverty level would be to say, let's make it clear that this program is intended to benefit needy people and give state agency heads who might want to spend on folks who are not needy more constraints to focus those dollars on the folks who actually need to benefit from TANF.
And then, Mr. Auditor, what have you done in Mississippi, or has the state done to make sure this doesn't happen again?
So the first few steps were obviously all audit steps. So we performed our single audit. We then reported what we found in the single audit to HHS. Mr. Carter actually was at HHS at the time and was incredibly responsive when he was there when we reported all this misspending to the federal agency. In addition to that, as we finished out our single audits, I encouraged our Department of Human Services to hire a private CPA firm to check our work, basically. And he then went out and hired a private CPA firm from Baltimore, Maryland, who came in. They also determined that tens of millions of dollars of TANF funds had been misspent in violation of TANF. And so then after that happened, I used my legal authority to demand over $96 million back from the folks who either benefited from the TANF funds or the folks who authorized the spending of the TANF funds. After those demands were issued, the state of Mississippi has now sued many of those individuals. And so that case, that civil case, is alive in state court right now and is currently being litigated. As I said, on the other side of this, the criminal side of this, prosecutors are still considering who they would like to charge. 6 folks have pleaded guilty. 2 more have been indicted who have not pleaded guilty. So that's where we are in terms of sending the public a message that this is not going to be allowed in Mississippi anymore.
Thank you. I'll next turn to Director Nodell. In your testimony, you provided the example where Governor Parsons in Missouri vetoed $7.9 million in TANF funding, including some for purposes outside the scope of the program. Could you share more on what role your state legislature plays in determining how state TANF non-assistance funds are used? And how do you work with state legislators to ensure their proposed project fit within TANF statutory goals?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. We do, at the Department of Social Services, work very closely with our General Assembly, and our General Assembly is very aggressive and very eager to strategically use TANF dollars, block grant dollars, to meet community needs in their districts. Now, from time to time, we find, and we have found in Missouri overwhelmingly, that the projects that they seek funding for do, many cases do fit within, the 4 purposes of TANF, but sometimes they don't. And that doesn't mean that they are bad public policy or bad initiatives. That simply means that they don't fit TANF. So we work very closely with members as they craft the state budget, because our dollars are appropriated through the General Assembly, and after which, we go through a procurement, contracting, very close program monitoring process. But again, legislators are eager to use those dollars, and we're very aggressive to steer them away from TANF when it is not an appropriate use. And sometimes those projects will make it through the legislative process and reach the governor's desk. For example, we had one project this year. It was a program that we have continued to fund year after year, a very worthy TANF program to the tune of about $3 million per year. An additional million was included for a building. And, we realize that capital projects are not allowable TANF expenditures. Therefore, that $1 million was line item vetoed by the governor. There was another project that one of our partners in Kansas City was proposing that actually, as the project matured and began to develop, would take place predominantly on the Kansas side of the Kansas City, Missouri regional area. So those dollars were reduced. And we do, our legislature likes to very aggressively spend our TANF dollars. We don't want to put them in the bank, and so we do get very close and sometimes have to reduce if the legislature over appropriates the TANF dollars that we have available. But it is constant communication. We do monitor these projects, and in Missouri we have a very stringent procurement contracting process to make sure that standards are considered, that are followed, that are implemented, and we do monitor as a department and employ contractual monitoring all the way to the subrecipient level.
Thank you, Director. Before I turn it over to Mr. Davis, one question for you, Director Putnam. How is your team reevaluating Arkansas's past non-assistance funding grants, and what is your process for refocusing on outcomes, expediting reviews, and defunding some grants and doubling down on others?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We are looking at all of the subgrants that have been awarded over the years. There are some subgrants that have yielded positive outcomes, so we'll look at continuing those, but we are not automatically renewing as there have been some automatic renewals in the past. We're also looking at the program management costs by consolidating the TANF program into Department of Human Services, working with our county offices that we have in every county across the state. We are also reducing the administrative cost to oversee the program and the financial controls necessary.
Thank you for that. I yield to Ranking Member Davis.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Neandora, I'm appalled that many states have chosen to hoard roughly $6 billion in TANF rather than spend these funds as intended to help poor families with children. Could you talk about the disconnect between the ability for these families and individuals to receive the TANF benefits in the state of Mississippi?
Yes, thank you for that question. So I am sitting here and I have this visual of a Band-Aid trying to go over a geyser, because I feel like that's the conversation that we're having right now as it relates to TANF. We're talking about a Band-Aid over a geyser. TANF is woefully inadequate in the state of Mississippi and other states as well. The families are so afraid of the sanctions and the burdensome paperwork that it takes to actually go about receiving these benefits that they have made a cost-benefit analysis just not to receive the benefits at all. And an example of this is that if you go through the process of trying to receive TANF in Mississippi and you don't go about fulfilling the requirements that are not laid out for you, so you don't actually know what those requirements are, they're at the whim of your caseworker. If you don't go about successfully fulfilling those requirements, you could be sanctioned. And that sanction could be you could lose your SNAP, you could lose your TANF, whatever the sanction is that the caseworker feels is appropriate. And that is a debilitating reality. And so families just choose not to participate in it. Less than 1% of families within Mississippi actually go about receiving cash assistance from TANF. And Mississippi is one of the poorest states within this country. So there's a clear disconnect. The argument that I've heard officials in Mississippi use is that they cannot find any poor people, in which I say go outside and throw a rock. You will eventually find one. as we are a state with a significant number of needs. And instead of going about having the conversation of how do we truly make sure that families receive the cash assistance that they need so that they can live a life of dignity, so that they can raise their kids, so that they can get to work. And since we keep talking about work, so that they can get to work, which is very expensive. Having a job is expensive when you're poor. You have to put gas in your car. You have to have a car. You have to be able to pay for the uniforms to get to work. And instead of making it easy for those processes to happen, we keep penalizing families and we keep providing families with what it is that we feel that they need instead of simply asking them, what is it that you need in order to live a life of dignity? And
Thank you. Thank you very much. Commissioner Carter, I'm aware of your work with fatherhood programs and fatherhood. That's work that I'm very interested in myself. In your testimony, you included the FY21 Trump budget justification for TANF from your time with the administration. And I'm glad to know that you're spending down the $700 million. But can you confirm that in the Trump budget recommended repealing Section 417 of TANF law that prohibits oversight?
Sorry, can you give me the end of the question again?
I think I'm asking if that prohibition was in the budget, or if you recall.
It was not in the, in what we proposed to be demonstrated. We didn't speak to not having federal oversight. The whole notion behind those demonstrations was to have states take a step back and look at how you could actually blend multiple safety net programs to achieve the objective of helping individuals and families grow beyond the social, economic, and developmental vulnerability that had them needs public supports. But nothing in that spoke to lack of federal oversight.
Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to interacting with you around the fatherhood initiatives. I'm very much interested in that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Pursuant to committee practice, we'll now move to 2-to-1 questioning. I now recognize Dr. Winstrup.
Thank you, Chairman LaHood, and thank you all for being here today and for holding this hearing. And I want to thank all the witnesses for taking the time to be with us. You know, based on the testimony we've heard today, there's clear need for better guardrails, accountability, and outcome measurement for TANF non-assistance spending. Last Congress, I introduced the Workforce Opportunity Realignment Kickstart Work Act. This bill is an example how we can implement outcome measurements in TANF and support Americans' transition from assistance into the workforce. Mr. Carter, very impressed with your resume and years of experience. So I want to start with you. 32 years. That's impressive. And I think that what we're talking about for a lot of people is an opportunity to develop basically the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you need to enter the workforce, and having those opportunities there. So when I look at that, I want to look at it, I guess, somewhat scientifically. I want to see what opportunities are missing for people. And I'll give you an example. You know, I go to a vocational school of kids that are learning welding, senior year in high school. They are the happiest kids alive because they know they got a job waiting for them. It's going to pay them well. That's the hope I think you talk about. Right. You know, and sometimes it's in your education, sometimes it's in your church, sometimes it's in your family. But all of those things factor into the self-esteem that you may have and the life that you lead. But opportunities need to be there. But let's just talk about poverty for a second. I practiced medicine privately for 27 years. I took care of some of the poorest of the poor. And I understand the struggles, transportation struggles, all those types of things. We tried to work with our patients on those. But for poverty itself, what are some of the common denominators that you find that people have in poverty? And I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I look at education, family structure, faith, all those types of things. You mentioned rural access because it's too far. What are some of the things that you've seen over the years?
Well, we certainly have seen the broad range of challenges and conditions that lead to poverty. And quite frankly, the design and operation of our safety net, it doesn't address those. Our argument is that our system has to become person or family centric. And what we mean by that is we've got to begin with that individual or that family, understand their unique problems, not try to fit them into our individual programs, but understand them in their totality. And then we're able to build a service plan that addresses the whole component or the whole person. I think Secretary Putnam said the folks that we serve, they don't come to us in the bits and pieces of our programs. They come to us as whole and connected individuals and families, and our system isn't designed to address that.
So that's what I think we need to be talking about a lot. And I'll give you an example. There's a county in my district that was part of something under the Obama administration called Rural Impact. And that gave the caseworker authorities to make things happen fast for that individual or that particular family. I meet a family, and it's a couple with 6 kids. And he says, I can't take that third shift job because I have nowhere to sleep when I come home because we're living in a one-room cabin. That's addressing the issue. And she was able, I see her a couple months later after I met that family. I said, how they doing? Because I got him into a home with bedrooms. He's working, she's working, and we got childcare. This is what we have to focus on, getting back to that individual and that family. And in the process, have guardrails of how we're spending our money, but and oversight over those decision-making processes that are taking place. So I appreciate it. I don't know if any of you heard of that Rural Impact Program, but I suggest take a look at it because I think it was pretty successful for the short time that it served, and maybe we need to take another look at it here and talk about implementing some of those things. That wasn't what I intended to ask about or talk about, but I think it was important. So anyway, I yield back. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Winstrup. Recognize Mr. Carey from Ohio.
Rookie.
Yeah, I'm a rookie here. I apologize. Mr. Chairman, I just want to make a point here. Is this the SEC committee? I'm looking at everybody. It's all SEC team. As a Big Ten person, I was a little disappointed in not seeing any of our Buckeyes here. But listen, Doctor, you touched on a few things, and I'm going to ask some other questions. First of all, really, we all appreciate you making the trip to D.C. We know it's a lot. We know it's tough to get in, but do appreciate, and we appreciate all of your testimonies. I know you all prepared, you worked on it, answering our questions. Doctor, I just want, tell me a little bit more about was it Magnolia Mothers Trust? And it is and I was pulling it up as you were talking about it, it's a cash ops. Where does the cash come from, number one? Number two, and it's only a year. They can't go on after that. Am I correct?
Yes, thank you for the question, Chair. Congressman, yes, it is a one-year program, $12,000 is the total, and it is only for that time period, and it doesn't go beyond that year. And it is privately funded, all philanthropic funding.
So it is no government money comes into this program?
No government money. We truly believe that the best way to lift families out of poverty is to give families money.
Yeah, I would ask my colleagues if you haven't Googled your program to Google it, because I think it is a success story. You started off with 20?
Yes, sir.
And you're in your 4th iteration now?
Yes, sir. We're going into our 5th year, and we've supported over 320 mothers. But not only is it our program, it really is a model that can be replicated to show how you can go about giving family resources, cash resources. Yeah. And the federal government has a perfect example with the child tax credit, which we have for 6 months as well, of how to go about giving families cash without restrictions. So.
Well, and as somebody that truly believes in the Alexis de Tocqueville book, Democracy in America, it shows that the private sector, that's what made America great, according to Alexis de Tocqueville. And so really was good to read about your program. I think it's fantastic. So
thank you.
I do have a couple questions here. Mr. Nodell, Missouri spends a large portion of your TANF non-assistant work funds on work, education, training activities. What are these programs, and how do you measure their success to make sure the TANF non-assistant spending is making a difference?
Thank you, Representative, for that question. In Missouri, we do monitor our programs with measurement, and I mean, ultimately, the measures, and we publicly publish each year our performance measures as a department in terms of how our programs perform. But each program is based on program quality, how many people are learning a skill successfully completed, and that's a certification, that's a degree, vocational training completion. It is employment rate. We also measure, whether that individual remains on public assistance or does not. We measure, do they return to public assistance in a reasonably short, amount of time. And so we also look at the efficiency of the dollar spent, whether that's administrative spending, whether that's, overhead or actually dollars to a program that is providing a service to a family. But our annual budget books that we're required by state statute to provide each year in the state of Missouri has detailed performance measures. We do, issue corrective action plans and sanction providers that do not perform at that level. And again, based on a single audit finding that we had several years ago, that my state auditor to my right would attest to the importance of the single audit process. We have implemented subrecipient monitoring as well.
I appreciate that. Mr. Carter, I'm going to ask you a question. Mr. White, I realize you're in the National Guard in Mississippi. Appreciate your service. What branch?
Air National Guard, sir.
Air National Guard.
Always tempted to salute Dr. Winstrup when I see him, too.
So am I.
Right.
So am I. Commissioner Carter, what recommendations do you have to ensure that TANF continues to be targeted toward, and we don't have a lot of time. So you know what? I'm going to yield back the balance of my time, and then for the record, I'll submit something for the record for you. So I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Carey. Recognize Ms. Moore from Wisconsin.
Thank you so very, very much, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to thank my colleagues for attending and all of our really great witnesses. This is prime time, and I'm not talking about Prime Day under Amazon, where we are all agreeing on the fact that TANF is just a story of waste, fraud, and abuse. But it's not waste, fraud, and abuse of, some recipient from Mississippi, getting $265 to which they're not entitled. It's the design of this program. The program is designed to provide money. It's building a huge bureaucracy. People are getting jobs to sanction welfare recipients. They're getting jobs in Wisconsin. When we started the program, Wisconsin, of course, is where welfare reform started. We had a position called diversion specialist, and it was that person's job to tell you that you didn't need any aid. Not only that, TANF was written and it provided bonuses to for-profit agencies and incentivized states, by giving them caseload reduction credits and money and stuff that they could use for decreasing the rolls. Now, that doesn't mean that the recipient would get a job. Just throw them off, and you could keep the profit. I'm reading from a budget paper. I was in the state legislature when we ended welfare as we know it in Wisconsin. And I'm just reading from one of the budget papers. I was on the Joint Committee on Finance at that time, and I pulled this out. Just to refresh my memory, this was unlimited money. There was no restrictions on the money. And this particular year, 1999-01 fiscal year, we provided $24 million in bonus money. And then you get to keep it. And I'll submit all this stuff for the record. I'm just looking at my colleagues here today. Ms. Sewell, in your state, only 7% of the total $196 million that your state got was spent on basic assistance. But 29% of it was spent on other services. I'm looking at California, which is, it's one of those woke states, that where they spent 37% of their money on helping people and only 13% on other services. Illinois, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, basic assistance, 4%. And, Mississippi, oh, well, 6% on basic assistance. Now, Commissioner Carter, you're not on the committee, but I thought I would look up what you guys do. And I don't want my time to run out because I do have a question. You guys spend like 37% of your, or 41% on basic assistance versus 1% versus 1% on other services. Now, I'm sorry that you guys are picking on poor Brett Favre. He was a quarterback for Wisconsin. I was a fan. But all I'm saying is that this isn't just started. I mean, I've had communities that have spent money on infrastructure, like I said, for luxury apartments. Brett Favre is just one of them. He's not all of them. Now, I do have a question for Dr. Nyandoro. These non-assistance spending is a topic here today. But what should we really be talking about in terms of solving poverty? You mentioned a few things, like your project, like the child tax credit, which cut poverty in half. And then the earned income tax credit, which in Wisconsin, I was the one that negotiated at least using some of the TANF dollars to provide the earned income tax credit. What would you say? I have 20 seconds left and I'll yield to you.
All I need is 5. We just need to figure out how to give families more money without restrictions. So we need to increase the basic assistance that's
I
provided.
just want to
to
know,
families.
trying to force people to go to work, how has that worked?
It hasn't. That's why we're having this conversation.
Okay. Well, thank you. And Mr.
Thank you.
Chairman, I just want to thank you for this hearing. It's prime time because we all agree this program is a failure, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. Recognize Mr. Moore. from Utah.
Excuse me. I would like to ask unanimous consent to have more time to put things in the record, if that's appropriate now, or I'll wait.
So ordered.
Okay. Can I tell you what I want to put in?
Why don't you put them together and then we'll do it here when,
Okay, thank you, sir.
thank you.
I yield
Recognize
back.
Mr. Moore, Utah.
Thank you, Chairman. Given the SEC comments, I'd just like to also add my opinion that I think playing only 8 games against any real teams is kind of a travesty and puts it on an illegal, an unfair footing across the nation. But I won't worry about that. Where the Pac-12 actually engages in real competition. So, Ms. Putnam, Utah's labor force participation rate, which I would say every single state, wish we could have them all higher, but we've fully recovered after the pandemic. A lot of that has to do with strong state leadership and our success of using TANF non-assistance dollars to fund work and preparation activities. According to HHS, Utah spent nearly 20% of its TANF funds on work education and training programs in 2021. The national average, for comparison, is only 7.6%. So I don't think it's any surprise that our workforce is doing really well among a lot of other factors, but that particular is something that we really focused on and making sure that we were using the money very effectively, particularly as people were getting displaced and retraining and reskilling and all that type of stuff. You mentioned that Arkansas has the lowest labor force participation rate in the country. What is Arkansas's strategy to meet its residents where they are and help them get back into the workforce using TANF non-assistance funds?
Thank you for the question. It may not be the lowest, but it's very near the lowest. Our workforce participation rate hovers around 56 to 57%. Our plan, again, is we have the Workforce Cabinet, which has the 6 cabinet secretaries who have anything to do with education, technical and career education, and workforce development. So we are looking at strategic investment opportunities for TANF, and what I mean by that is there is Oklahoma actually has been leading on this, but we we want to use the Workforce Cabinet and work with philanthropic organizations and community organizations and look at investment strategies that they are using, align them with the outcomes that we wish to accomplish, which include really redirecting education to come to meaningful outcomes and be informed by employers, and sector strategy from our labor force markets.
Thank you so much. Mr. Carter, I may be biased, but prior to coming to Congress, I worked for a firm that did a lot of monitoring and evaluation, particularly in the social impact space. And I noticed in your testimony, I really appreciated you kind of highlighting that as a state, you were very interested in putting together some evaluation of how your programs were going, and then you were prohibited from doing that with the TANF non-assistance funds. Can you just kind of share a little bit, elaborate a little bit more on that? And then there was a previous question that I think you may have wanted to respond to as well.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So our governor and legislature, when we put together this legislation to, in an impactful way, spend our TANF dollars, one of the things they said is, we want to know what works. And so we want to evaluate the things that you were going to spend these dollars on. And so we went about trying to engage an evaluation firm, but we're informed by our federal partners that it doesn't meet an eligible TANF purpose. So literally, you couldn't spend money on the program to understanding it what works. So we had to spend our own state money in order to do that. But we've done that, and we have random control trials for all 7 of these, and they really are very much the gold standard. We will know when we get to the end of these 3-year demonstration periods, we will know what component parts of the 7 work, what don't work, and then that will help us reshape our overall TANF program going forward. And the other thing I just wanted to speak to, this idea of forcing people to work as if somehow work is a bad 4-letter word. We believe that every employment opportunity that is moral, legal, and ethical, and its intended earnings create a pathway to freedom. And so I then hearken back to Secretary Putnam's ABCs: a job, a better job, a career. But there's nothing wrong. I mean, work is essential. And so we think that we need to, that helps create the pathway beyond. And so it is an important component part of how we are going about transforming Tennessee's safety net.
Thank you so much, and I'll just kind of close with, I appreciate those comments. And then before, as the federal government, all we do, we're pound and penny foolish. We refuse to spend a little bit of money smartly to have greater impact, and this is a clear example of that. So thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Recognize Ms. Steele of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for sharing concerns on how states are using non-assistance funding for TANF and issues with the current law. I hope we can work in a bipartisan manner to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse within the program. 2 major things I always hear about from our constituents, my constituents, and small businesses in my district is lack of workforce development and childcare. Having said that, Auditor White, from your perspective, in what ways did the current TANF law help enable the kickback scheme scandal to unfold, grow, and continue?
Thank you for the question. So I discussed a little bit briefly about the lack of monitoring and then the lack of enforcement from HHS when an agency doesn't monitor. So I'd say that structure of the program helped enable the fraud that we saw in Mississippi. I'd add to that and say that, I think that over the course of the last few years, we have not seen the federal government take strong action when misspending does happen. So in Mississippi, for example, we submitted our single audit in the spring of 2020. That's obviously over 3 years ago. And to date, we don't know what HHS's response will be to that audit. So the state of Mississippi is still waiting to hear. I think HHS and the federal government could send a strong signal to states that the program itself takes fraud and misspending very seriously by telling the state what it needs to remedy and then what penalties it's going to impose on the state. Again, we're talking about in Mississippi likely north of $100 million of misspending when you add the TANF misspending to the other misspending in programs that don't include TANF, SNAP, and CCDF. So we have state lawmakers in Mississippi waiting to figure out how much they're going to have to pay back into the TANF fund or other funds. So again, as a programmatic problem, there's not a strong signal being sent from the federal government that TANF misspending and TANF fraud is being taken seriously.
Did you hear anything from HHS that they're gonna respond right away, or they are not just, or they just totally ignoring your states?
They did not totally ignore. So we sent our single audit in the first half of 2020. Mr. Carter was actually at HHS at the time. He responded very quickly, and we had good communications with him. But I would say that when the administration changed, there was a fall off in communication. My office has not communicated with HHS since August of 2021. I don't know how frequently our Department of Human Services communicates with HHS today. I don't know what sort of technical assistance that office is providing to Mississippi's DHS, but I can tell you there has been frustration that I've heard from our DHS that there is a lack of clarity about what the federal government is going to do about what happened in Mississippi.
So you hear from other states too, or just only your state that you're stating today?
Mainly my communications with our Department of Human Services. Yes, ma'am.
Secretary Putnam, some states spend TANF dollars on child care directly, and others transfer to the Child Care and Development Block Grant. Do you have insight as to why states spend directly, and does that create duplication and fragmentation for families? And why do states choose to spend directly on child care versus transferring? And do you think the current 30% cap on transfers is the right amount?
Thank you. I think there are several questions in there for
There's
me.
three.
There are three questions.
Yeah.
The question about insights as to why states choose to spend directly on childcare versus making a transfer, I don't currently have insight into that. I seek to gain some insight as we have just moved TANF over to DHS as of July 1st of this year. The question about whether the 30% cap on transfers, I do think that the 30% allows for flexibility. I think that conversations with this committee could yield whether or not that should be increased, perhaps it should be decreased. So there is the transfer, I think, is not at issue as much as your question about the fragmentation for families. That is the biggest question that I seek to answer, and I seek your help on, because there is fragmentation not just with TANF across the different programs that it's able to fund statewide, but also with the federal programs that we have to, as state leadership, cobble together to try to serve that whole family. I appreciated Dr. Winstrup's comment about the rural program and the worker being able to work fast. We like to go fast in Arkansas. We would like to be able to move resources quickly to families, but we want to do it under the appropriate oversight. And so if that means that the transfer is an appropriate oversight and can be tracked, then that would be a good direction to move in.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have another question, but I'm gonna just submit it so we can get the answer later on. So thank you.
Thank
I
you,
yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. Now I yield to Mr. Evans of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield to my colleague from Wisconsin, because I was in the state legislature in Pennsylvania. She was in the room.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. I'll be brief. I just want to respond to Commissioner Carter. And I agree with you. Work is not a dirty word. All of us are at work now. But I make enough money to have cleaned this suit and gotten my hair done and to buy toothpaste. Work that is bereft of adequate benefits associated with it is called slavery. There's a name for that kind of work. And I don't appreciate the federal government being a partner in trying to fill the needs of our low-wage workforce with TANF recipients and disallowing them good education and training so that they can indeed climb that career ladder. When you tried to do that in Tennessee, they told you that it didn't work. You can't really help anybody become a nurse or anything like that under current rules. You really? To go to college?
Most certainly.
No, you can't.
Yes, ma'am, I can.
All right. So Anyway, I'm going to yield back to Mr. Evans, and maybe he'll take you up on that. But the way this program is structured, you work activities, you cannot get childcare and all of that unless you are meeting these work requirements, which are very, very defined and restricted. I yield back to you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I and my Democratic colleagues are serious about lifting American families out of poverty. There are many ways we can better support families. If Republican colleagues are serious about lifting American families out of poverty, I would urge them to support expanding the child tax credit. If Republican colleagues are serious about lifting American families out of poverty, I would urge them to support a career pathway approach to workforce development, like the Healthy Professional Opportunity Grant Program that is under this committee's jurisdiction. If already incredibly stressful for families to navigate the burdensome requirement tied by the federal government, many families already struggle to afford necessities. The lack of access to important support services, including paid family leave and medical service. I see absolutely no need to impose drastic work requirements on federal assistance that would make it much harder for families to thrive. I see absolutely no need to make it even more difficult for low-income families to access the help they need. Instead, we need to respect and trust families. My congressional district encompasses a place called Philadelphia, our nation's poorest big city. I represent many communities that are trying to rise above persistent poverty. They've been marred by generations due to racial policies, including redlining. It is important, if we're going to have a serious discussion, Mr. Chairman. We have some ideas. Matter of fact, my colleague Terry Sewell, my colleague Gwen Moore worked under previous people to build on it. So we know what to do, but we just need to do it. Again, I'd like to thank you and yield back to the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Yield to Mr. Smucker of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a great discussion. I'd like to thank each of the panelists for the work that you're doing. I think all of us, and to Mr. Evans' point, my colleague from Pennsylvania and great friend, I think all of us, both parties, are very interested, are grateful, I should say, to live in a country where there is a safety net, where people can get assistance when they need it, and when there is hopefully a pathway to that family-sustaining job that is really important. And I think these kind of discussions are critical to ensuring that we're doing the best that we can from our level and at every level to ensure that works. And I think, Mr. Carter, some of the points that you made were really important. All of you did, but I particularly related, you talked about families are a unit, and when they go to access programs, it's disjointed and there's silos, and it's very difficult to do that. And in my community, there was an initiative before COVID, it sort of fell apart, but where all of the individuals and groups came together and created a program, and it was aptly named One Great Job or something of that, and essentially measured by people coming into the system and then being connected to a job. But it was all of the agencies working together, actually software where someone could sort of come into the system and be referred to the help they needed, and they didn't have to keep going around. And I wish we did more to incentivize that kind of work rather than creating silos. And so I think to some degree, we're not going to be able to do that at the federal level. It's going to have to be done at your levels and even at the county level. And so the question I have, I guess, and Mr. Carter, back to you again, you talked about Tennessee. You said, I believe before you came there, had the highest level at about $800 million of dollars that weren't spent for some reason. Well, Pennsylvania is right behind that. Right. We were around $700 million. I guess I'd like to understand how that happens. I frankly don't know. And then how can we at the federal level give the states optimum flexibility, but also ensure that there's accountability in the process?
So thanks for the question. I would say that how it happens is a lack of innovation for how to use those dollars to grow the capacity of those served to reduce their dependency. Okay? A lot of discussion here about needing more cash assistance. I think that we need more innovation around the intention to help that family grow beyond the vulnerability so that one day they can take the baton of their life and run their own race. We've not designed this intentionally to achieve that objective. So what happens is you have your basic cash assistance, and then whatever dollars the state chooses to use to achieve other objectives, child welfare, child care, what have you, and then that which isn't spent, because there isn't a shelf life to it, it just accrues. And so over the course of years in Tennessee, we accrued north of $700 million. It wasn't that we didn't have eligible families, okay? It was that we were not being innovative enough with how to put those dollars to use, and we've turned the ship on that.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to continue that discussion. Mr. White, maybe a similar question after what you've seen in Mississippi. What kind of guardrails should we be thinking about here in this committee and at the federal level to ensure that we don't have a repeat of what happened in Mississippi?
Thank you, sir, for the question. And I just generally point out, I know that there's a natural tension between flexibility and accountability too. I know agency heads want flexibility to engage in creative practices. And as an auditor, it's important to just point out, sometimes too much flexibility can send the signal that no one is watching where the money is going. So first you engage in an innovative program, and then you decide, well, I'm just going to donate some TANF money to the American Heart Association because I like the American Heart Association and that seems fine. And then you start spending money on renting an office space that you happen to own as a nonprofit head, but you're not actually using the office space. And I think these dominoes fall because people start to believe, people who are handling the money start to believe that no one is watching. So there's a middle ground balance to strike between flexibility and accountability. And as just another example of an accountability measure that I think strikes that middle ground, Congressman Moore pointed this out. We did a terrible job in Mississippi of tracking outcomes and allowing DHS to track outcomes and then demanding that the agency head sign statements that show how many people were actually helped with TANF dollars. If that measure had been put into place, then I think you would see both a mix of innovation to drive outcomes and accountability where the outcomes would have to be proven to HHS.
Thank you.
I now yield to Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses. I apologize I had to step out briefly and missed some of your testimony, but this is such a timely topic. And amidst the economic struggles that many are facing, I hope we don't make the mistake of focusing so many efforts on just tax dollars rather than human dignity. And I had the honor of chairing this subcommittee back in 2018 when I first introduced a bill called Jobs for Success Act, emphasis Jobs for Success. That it wasn't just the Jobs Act of 2018, but Jobs for Success. And I worry that we, perhaps in the interest of checking boxes, we'll perhaps push someone toward a job, but then that's it, out the door, out of our minds. And yet that in and of itself will likely not have a positive outcome unless that individual is in a position of upward trajectory and able to provide for his or her family and engage in the community. There can be numerous definitions of success. I get that, but I hope that we can focus on the ultimate outcomes rather than just checking boxes. I think that when you look at various, whether it's a state using TANF dollars to fund middle class private college scholarships, or the fraudulent case that was uncovered, Mr. White, by your efforts, I think we can do better. So I'm interested in working together so that we can focus on human dignity and doing better by individuals. And I'm curious, Auditor White, during your investigation, when you did uncover that TANF funds were not appropriately being used, for low-income Americans, how common or how, in terms of frequency, would you say dollars were spent where they ought not be spent?
I would say the norm from 2016 to 2019 in Mississippi was for the dollars to be misspent rather than spent on an allowable purchase. So when we started looking back, we realized that at some point in 2016, when former Director Davis took over, large dollar grants were being given to two specific nonprofits, and over the course of the next 3 to 4 years, the dollar amounts of those grants increased dramatically. And so by the end, you were seeing the main bulk of TANF money in Mississippi going to the nonprofits, and the nonprofits spending them in ways that at minimum they could not show it was leading to human flourishing or a benefit to anyone who is needy, and at worst going to either line folks' pockets or being spent fraudulently. So it was really a tragedy that unfolded in a very short amount of time over the course of 3 to 4 years.
Thank you. Mr. Nodal, how would you perhaps reflect on the monitoring and tracking of the financial data and outcomes, and what your insight would be on that monitoring and tracking?
Well, I think it's important that it occur in real time. And we try to actually monitor programs with on-site visits and financial reviews within the first 6 months of a contract being awarded, and a service being provided, because so much of the auditing world is done after the fact and after dollars are out the door, dollars that our fellow citizens have paid in taxes. And so it's very important to us. Again, the programs that we fund in the state of Missouri are generally, very, very good public policy purposes. But sometimes you have new organizations that lack the bandwidth, they lack the resources to properly account for their dollars. They perhaps lack the back office support, to be able to do that. And so, we very much must have a culture of compliance. And I would echo, Auditor White's comments that I think a robust federal monitoring presence, a robust federal Office of Inspector General presence around these programs will not only help states administer their programs correctly, but also send the message to the providers out there that, hey, this is not the Wild West. But, again, for us, it is monitoring and really working hand in hand throughout the process while the dollars are being spent, as opposed to after a look back.
Thank you. Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you. Now yield to Ms. Sewell of Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of our witnesses. I think that the overwhelming conclusion one can take from listening to the testimony and the questioning is that the TANF programs are not working the way that we all would want them to work. Because the reality is that, it's not just a federal program, it's a state program too, right? But the state have to spend the money in order to get more federal money. And as I understand it, the ability to have so much waste, fraud, and abuse in a program, and us continuously funding this program, knowing that this program is not addressing the real needs of the people who need that assistance. When I think about the fact that there are 4 funding sources, I guess TANF can fund 4 different things, right? It can fund assisting families. It can fund reducing the dependency of parents in need by promoting job, preparation and work. It can be used to prevent pregnancies among unmarried persons, and it can be used to encourage the formation and maintenance of two-parent households or two-parent households. States can define needy whatever way they want to define needy. And I'm here to tell you that the state of Alabama, like the state of Mississippi, like the state of Florida, I can go down the list, define it in such a narrow way. I mean, people have to be like downright dirt poor in order to get TANF. When we know the cost of living has soared, the fact that you have to have, money not only for child care but health care, and the interdependency of these different programs, I think about I think about the fact that the first two that I just said, we define that, we leave the discretion up to the states, and I don't understand how the federal government continuously funds a program that does not actually do what it's meant to do. So that's why I want to talk to you, Doctor, about whether or not, like, if you could, how would you reimagine this program? How if you had, a group of policymakers in front of you, how would you tell them to reimagine this program? Policymakers, oh, by the way, that have the jurisdiction to change this program. Please.
Thank you so much for that question. If I had the power to reimagine TANF, I would reimagine it with the families at the center. We keep talking about having an audit and doing an audit of financial spending. How about we actually do an audit of what families' needs are? How about we actually have a panel with families and say, what is it that it is that you need? Where are you dreaming and how do we meet you there? So many families that live in poverty, we come in with them with this ideal of telling them what it is that they need, what it is that they don't need, how they must govern their lives. We tell them that, oh, you should take your baton back. We shouldn't have their baton to begin with. So I would start by auditing the families and having those conversations with them. The 4 pillars that we have in TANF probably no longer make sense for where we are today.
I think just reading it aloud, I think that we all should think it's being very paternalistic.
It is very paternalistic. The work requirements within TANF are paternalistic. They are some of the most paternalistic and restrictive. We are not saying that families should not have to work. We are saying that families should not be required to take any job that we say they have to take. In a lot of instances, those jobs are minimum wage jobs with no benefits, no protections, no ability to be sick, to take care of your children. But we're saying that's what you have to do because you have to work. And we're tying work with dignity. And we have this very narrow definition of work, just like we have a very narrow definition of needy. So if I had politicians at my whim, I would say,
You definitely have an audience with them for the next 2 more minutes. Go for it.
I would say, let's reimagine TANF and really take ourselves out of the equation and put families at the center.
I also know that the paperwork is arduous. The fact of the matter is that you can only make a certain amount of money to stay on TANF, so you're not even encouraged to get a better job, let alone have the resources or to actually go to school to better yourself. I feel like we're creating the perpetual cycle. Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member, I think that we would be well served if we had a small task force of Republicans and Democrats to really focus in on redesigning TANF so that it really does get to the assistance of needy families, not all this other waste that's going on. And we know it's going on, we hear about it's going on, but we don't do anything to change that. And I don't think that we should be punitive to families. We need to be punitive to the folks who are behind all this fraud. And we need to utilize the money, a lot of really, good taxpayer money going for a safety net. Let's really make a net that is safe. Thanks. I yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Sewell. Recognize Ms. Tenney of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this meeting, and thank you to the witnesses. Really appreciate what you do. I know this isn't easy, and I thank you to my colleagues for your comments. And we know this is a tough issue. And look, nobody wants the truly needy not to get the services that they need. And as Ms. Sewell just pointed out, we want to make sure that the people who are taking advantage of the system aren't able to take advantage any longer. And how do we really get to the people that are truly needy? So I appreciate all your comments on that. But I will say I come from a state like New York where we don't have very good controls. And the HHS, Office of Inspector General, recently audited New York's TANF program and found significant areas of noncompliance with their federal requirements, although we're obviously concerned about the nature of the federal requirements, the focus of TANF. But the OIG's findings concluded that New York could not ensure that its reported TANF program expenditures in 2016, which were over $4.8 billion, met federal requirements and were used in accordance with the intended purposes of the program. So we do have a problem with people taking advantage and really hurting the people that are truly needy, which is, I think we need to focus on that. I was going to ask maybe Secretary Putnam first, how, and I know this question was asked by Mr. Smith and others, how does Arkansas ensure that proper accountability for TANF-funded contracts and projects funded through grantees and subcontractors? What process is used to ensure that they meet the purpose? And I want to take just note of the fact that Mr. Smith talked about process versus outcomes. And I think it's really important that we deal with outcomes and not checking boxes. And I think it actually harkens back to Mrs. Mandero's, let's talk about the families. What do they need? How do we make sure they have good outcomes and that a job is a fit? What would you do on some of these issues with the grantees, sub-grantees, and how does Arkansas deal with that? Well, maybe we could help New York do a better job and save some money to the taxpayers. The highest tax in the country right now, by the way. We beat California recently.
Well, my husband is from New York, and there's a reason he no longer lives there. But I will start by saying that again, we at DHS have recently we've transferred the TANF program over to Department of Human Services. We're working with the Division of Workforce Services, who previously had responsibility for the TANF grants and the sub-grantees and recipients. I think really to Auditor White's comments about paying attention, I think that, recognizing that there does need to be flexibility, there is a benefit to cash assistance as a component of this program. There's also a huge benefit in the flexibility of the non-cash assistance part, to Commissioner Carter's comments about being able to support someone moving into a nursing position who wasn't in that position before. So I think the question really becomes all of us paying attention collectively together. In Arkansas specifically, though, we are going to subject the sub-grants made through TANF to the same kind of fiscal controls that we currently have with our other with our other programs like SNAP Medicaid and the Child Care Development Program.
Well, let me ask you, is there enough flexibility in the program to tailor it to a family? Is that something that you can do in Arkansas, under Arkansas's laws?
We believe there is enough flexibility to tailor it to the needs of the family, but it, to the doctor's point, it takes relationships as well. It's not just about checking boxes and putting the requirements first. It's really about assessing the needs of the individuals, the needs of the communities, and working with those families and the communities to make sure that we are holding them accountable for the outcomes that they profess they want to meet for their communities and for the economic stability of their families.
Well, thank you, Mr. Carter. You're nodding your head. So I wanted to say, you mentioned the State Advisory Board for TANF output or input. What does that look like, and how do you have the flexibility? Is that a model we can replicate in New York to give the flexibility and the human touch to helping people with really, everyone's unique. That's our system. We recognize people are unique in our system of government, and that's why we have decisional law, not codes. Let's get away from process. Let's get towards outcomes and really dealing directly with families. How have you been able to successfully do that in your position?
First of all, begin with that intention. I think when Chairman Smith talked about not just checking the box and looking at human dignity and that sort, what is troubling is that we're not held accountable for human dignity, for thriving, for freedom. We're held accountable for checking the box.
Exactly.
Okay? And that is where we have to drive the kinds of changes in the system. It ought to be our intention the day that individual or family shows up on our doorstep. It ought to be our intention to help them meet the immediate crisis and then immediately pivot to how do we come alongside you and help you grow beyond this vulnerability. It is not that we don't want to serve you. It is that we don't wish for any of our neighbors to have to live on the scraps from the public table. And so it ought to be our societal intention to help folks grow beyond. And if you start with that notion in mind, you can absolutely tailor TANF to achieve that objective.
My time is up, but I'd love to hear more from you offline. Thanks so much to the witnesses again. Thank you, everyone, for your insight.
Thank you, Ms. Tenney. Yep, Ms. Moore.
I'd like to be recognized, sir, to add
Yeah,
things.
for what purpose do you want to be recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to add materials to the records to which I referred during my questioning during my time.
Without objection.
Thank you. First of all, some data from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, where I selected some states representative of our committee and some of our witnesses on the amount of spending for basic assistance as compared to other categories. I'd like to enter that into the record.
Without objection, Ms. Moore, that'll be entered.
I also would like to, I also referred to the structure of the program, which Wisconsin has the credit for starting it in our state. We ended welfare as we know it first before anyone else. And so people modeled their programs after ours.
Without objection.
And
that'll be entered.
we created an incentive for people to provide profits to companies if they reduce their caseloads. So I'd like to enter a Workforce Development, Economic Support, and Child Care Legislative Fiscal Bureau paper to my pile of papers here. And the last thing I want to
Without objection.
is an audit from the Wisconsin legislature on Maximus, a Virginia-based for-profit agency on questionable expenses that they had. And
So ordered.
okay, thank you.
Chairman,
Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Davis.
I yield back.
I'd like to submit for the record the bulletins from Chapin Hall.
So ordered, without objection. Thank you. That concludes our question and answer period today. I want to thank all of the members here today for their questions and obviously the witnesses before us for your substantive testimony, your suggestions, your ideas, the things that you caused us to think about here today. Very, very helpful as we continue to do our work on figuring out how we reimagine TANF, as Ms. Sewell said, and keeping in mind, obviously, the taxpayer and how we are fiscally responsible with the money that we spend with taxpayer money, which is always important. And then figuring out, I think, as you said, Commissioner Carter, how do we help grow you out of poverty? I think you used the analogy of creating the opportunity to give you the baton to run your own race. And that stuck with me. And so we, again, are grateful for you being here today. And I think everyone here shares the belief and understanding that our responsibility to taxpayers and low-income families is to ensure that TANF funds are spent wholly to lift Americans out of poverty. And so I'm hopeful that we can work together on developing bipartisan reforms to this program to make sure critical welfare dollars are being used for their intended purposes. So I'm pleased to be advised that members will have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal record. And again, I want to thank you all for the time and effort it took to be here. We look forward to staying in touch. The committee is adjourned.